formidable, ruthless, noble, terrible, skilled, revered. All this and much more can be said about the Vikings. There was a time when these proud warriors reigned supreme in their part of the world. But who are the Vikings? Where did they come from and what happened to them in the end? Friends, I welcome you to my channel and let's get to know the rich history of this people better together. In an age marked by steel and blood, the Vikings emerged from the frozen lands of the north as an unstoppable force. On wild horses and bloody battlefields, these warriors created immortal legends, sowing fear and respect. They were not just raiders, but explorers, traders, and leaders whose ambitions and place of glory forever changed the course of history, a history of the most mysterious and courageous peoples the world has ever known. The Anglo-Saxons believed that the Vikings came from Denmark, but later it turned out that this was not entirely true. In fact, they came from many different regions of Scandinavia, including Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and others. This sheds light on the origins of the Vikings. But the Vikings were constantly looking beyond the Scandinavian region. They explored new horizons, traded, and raided large parts of Europe. This historical period lasted from the 8th to the 11th century and was called the Viking Age. During this time, the Vikings struck fear into their enemies by plundering coastal areas that had previously been peaceful and quiet. The Vikings were the first and most prominent warriors of the Scandinavian region. They were often spoken of as villains or barbarians, and for good reason, because they attacked and plundered peaceful coastal towns and monasteries all over Europe. And yet, this is only one side of their life. Historical facts show that this people also wanted a calm, normal life. Among the Vikings were not only warriors, but also master craftsmen, farmers, traders, sailors, and simply peaceful settlers. A Viking, according to his interpretation, is a person who sailed away from home, left his homeland, that is, a sea warrior, a pirate who went on a campaign for prey. In ancient times, the enterprise itself was more often called a robbery campaign than the person who participated in it. The concepts of trading enterprise and robbery enterprise were strictly distinguished. In the eyes of the Scandinavians themselves, the word Viking also had a negative connotation. According to another version, the word Viking means nautical mile, the distance between shifts of rowers. The Vikings could not survive solely by plundering distant lands. Someone had to establish settlements, cultivate the land, and raise cattle. But to those they attacked, they were all Vikings. Unfortunately, their victims only saw this side of their culture, and often it was the last thing they saw in their lives. They also traded, including with distant lands. The Vikings' land trade routes passed through Russia and reached Constantinople in what is now Turkey. The Vikings operated over vast territories, even reaching Baghdad in Iraq. As the Vikings traveled around the world, they encountered very different peoples, so they had to use different languages to communicate. In their homeland, they spoke a language that is now called Old Norse. Old Norse is a North Germanic language that was spoken in most of the Scandinavian region, including the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. Old Norse was also spoken in parts of Russia, France, the British Isles, and Ireland. Historians have found many ancient runes and inscriptions that provide information about how Old Norse was used. The runic script is called the Younger Futhark or Scandinavian runes. It is a runic alphabet that consisted of 16 symbols and was primarily used during the Viking Age. As the Vikings' influence and power waned, it gradually fell out of use. What did the Vikings trade? The Vikings were able to travel long distances, both by land and sea, as few people in their time could match them in shipping. This is one of the reasons why they were able to conquer so many peoples they encountered along the way. But what did they trade during their travels? What did they bring back with them? Viking traders often wanted to buy luxury goods, such as silverware, silk, spices, wine, jewelry, glass, and pottery. All of these were in demand by the Vikings in their homeland. In exchange, they brought honey, tin, wheat, wool, wood, iron, fur, leather, fish, and walrus tusks. Unfortunately, the Vikings' trading history also has a dark side, as they were heavily involved in the slave trade. Viking attacks in Europe. Although not all Vikings were ruthless robbers and plunderers, they certainly earned that reputation. They killed and plundered, and when they returned home, they proudly told their loved ones about their exploits. The first documented attack on Anglo-Saxon territory occurred around 787. It began a confrontation that lasted for several centuries. When the Vikings first appeared off the coast of Britain, the local population, in their simplicity of soul, prepared to accept them with open arms. Unarmed people gathered on the shore to greet the overseas guests. They paid dearly for this mistake. The Vikings swept along the coast like a plague, bringing death to the naive and defenseless inhabitants of these places. Their ferocity and cruelty terrified and dismayed the British. The Vikings willingly plundered their holy places, such as Christian monasteries, where gold, silver, livestock, and other riches were abundant. For many, this was sacrilege, but the Vikings were hungry for easy money and saw no problem with it. They had no doubts about attacking holy monasteries, since they were pagans and the beliefs of the local population were foreign to them. As time went on, the conflicts between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons became more and more widespread and bloody. Vikings, the history of the Great Invasion. Since the population of Ireland and Britain increasingly resisted, and all the easy targets had already been plundered, the Vikings decided to unite and strike a joint blow to strengthen their power and seize the riches hidden in the Anglo-Saxon lands. In 865, a huge army was formed, called, according to various sources, the Great Danish or Great Heathen Army. It included warriors from all corners of the Scandinavian region, but mainly from Denmark. Before this, the Vikings had used the tactics of a quick battle and a quick retreat in their raids, to loot as much as possible before the enemy could fight back. The Vikings were happy with this state of affairs for a while, but, as often happens, their appetites began to grow. New goals required the creation of a larger and more skilled army, one that would allow them to penetrate deep into the territories of the Anglo-Saxons and establish their own settlements there. At the head of this army stood 3 of the 5 sons of the legendary warrior Ragnar Lodbrok: Hvitserk, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubba Ironside. The army was one of the largest of its time. The bloody war between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms lasted for 14 long years. Hoping to appease the invaders, Edmund the Martyr, the king of East Anglia, offered them a gift of many horses. As expected, the Vikings did not accept the gift and swept through the lands of East Anglia with destructive steps. King Edmund himself was killed. What happened to the Vikings? For 14 years, the Vikings sowed death and destruction across the lands of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Through a series of advances and retreats, the Great Heathen Army took control of most of northern England within a few years and seized power over the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. However, the Viking invasion stalled when a split appeared in their ranks and the army began to split into 2. This was the beginning of the end of the Viking military campaign. They suffered a defeat in a major battle against the forces of Wessex, the only kingdom that was able to withstand the onslaught of the invaders. An army led by King Alfred defeated half of the Viking army at the Battle of Edington in 878, ending their hopes of undivided power over the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.